For just one time, I would take the Northwest Passage to find the hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea, tracing one warm line through a land so wide and savage, and make a Northwest Passage to the sea. Westward from the Davis Strait 'tis there 'twas said to lie, the sea route to the Orient for which so many died, seeking gold and glory, leaving weathered broken bones, and a long forgotten lonely cairn of stones.
Hello, Canada and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland.
There are more of us than ever before. But it's always a question of quality as against quantity in this life.
You've got Rasminski and the Bank of Canada saying the country is going to pieces practically every year for the last 5 or 6 years.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
And Turner, just once any you nation. Do not have a monopoly on patriotism.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Red Ensign Special, Prarie, Populism, and Manufactured Consent. Now today we're going to talk a little bit about the construction of public opinion and about the interface between electoral politics and media presentations. Ordinarily I would not talk about this on the show, but there are just far too many really interesting media stories that have come together with Canadian electoral politics right at the Canadian and American electoral politics right at the moment. It's too interesting to kind of let this pass. For those of you watching on a visual platform, you will see I've highlighted a tweet looking at Tucker Carlson on his recent show. It's Tucker Carlson Tonight is what he's calling it these days, in which he is outlining his view of the parallels between Donald Trump in his current role as president of the United States and the biblical figure of the Antichrist. Now, this is not the first time. Let's just notice what Tucker is doing. Tucker Carlson objects to the relationship between Israel and the Trump administration. He objects to the Iran war in particular. And he has chosen to frame those objections. And he objects to Donald Trump's kind of megalomaniacal style, particularly his recent tweet, picturing himself loosely as Jesus. Tucker Carlson has chosen to frame these objections not in kind of the long-trodden. If Tucker Carlson was a political figure in the United Kingdom, critiquing a similar figure in government in that long tradition, he would frame Donald Trump as a kind of mad with kind of megalomaniacal political figure who's become obsessed with his own ego, something like that. He's sacrificing the good of the country on these kind of personal causes. That's how he would frame them in kind of the Anglo world. However, he has chosen instead to frame the Trump administration in parallel with the figure of the Antichrist, particularly as that figure emerges in sort of American folk apocalyptic Christianity, a kind of view of the world with which his audience is going to be intimately familiar, even if they do not necessarily agree. This fits in with a long-standing approach that Tucker has taken to some very serious issues. For example, he has repeatedly highlighted aliens and UFOs on his show. he has repeatedly highlighted the idea of the demonic in politics and public life. He has recently highlighted, taken the position publicly that Muslims love Jesus, which again is all of this kind of comes off in a certain way to an American political audience, combined with the way that his studio setup is, the kind of self-presentation that he's chosen. He's carefully constructed himself as a figure in line with what Hofstadter famously described as the paranoid style in American politics. This is a trope that the American public has a long historical relationship with. And the fact that Hofstadter describes it as the paranoid style is kind of derisive, but it's conspiratorial. It makes these kind of half-baked accusations. It takes these very religious framings or very conspiratorial framings for issues, and uses those framings as a way to introduce very, very serious underlying issues. Another really good example of this was the kind of Barack Obama birther movement, which, whether it's true or not, I don't really know that much about the underlying issue. What it was actually driving at, pointing out, is that Barack Obama was not American in the sense that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was American. He was not drawn from the old lost elite that had governed the country for the past 250 years. He was drawn from a completely different group of people. And so whether he was born in Kenya or not, whether he was really a secret Muslim or not, really was of no consequence. The accusation was intended to highlight the very much more obvious reality that Barack Obama was a representative of a different people group that had governed the country throughout its long history. And you can see Tucker Carlson adopting the same style to point at, to use kind of the same tactics to point at an underlying reality that will resonate with his audience in one way or another. I want to, as we go through this, draw attention back to Marshall McLuhan's point. The medium is the message. Tucker Carlson has correctly identified the elegant relationship between podcasting as a medium and this long-standing paranoid style that used to operate through leaflets, operated for a very long time via talk radio in the United States, and has this kind of long history of which podcasting is kind of an elegant pickup. And he's cultivated that persona as opposed to cultivating a persona intended to make himself an alternative for government. Right? So if Tucker Carlson really had an aspiration to become president, instead of adopting this tradition, he would probably try to treat himself a little bit more seriously, especially given the kinds of elections that are likely to be fought in the future. This comes back to an idea that if you're at this channel, you should already be deeply familiar with. So we're talking about propaganda and its pathway through American, Canadian society. We're talking about this because public opinion in the Great Main is not a product of the free choice of irrational, free-thinking people. In point of fact, public opinion is a carefully constructed artifact shaped by the media and information environment that people are exposed to. In our society, whether Canada or the United States, children are indoctrinated from the age of 4 or 5 throughout their life into a carefully cultivated media environment, whether it's the way that the public school curriculum is treated, the way that the medium of public school is architected with a certain kind of managerial authority that is exercised over students, whether it's the way that funding is pointed at universities in order to drive certain narratives and in order to reward students and faculty for pursuing certain ideas, or whether it's as adults, the various mass media presentations which shape public opinion. Tucker Carlson is an element of that media ecosystem in the United States, and he's playing a well-trodden kind of archetypal part in that public imagination. In the United States, you have a multiple story state, and so that public imagination is in some way kind of schizophrenic, which enhances the complexity of the part that Carlson has to play, and the part, for that matter, that Donald Trump has to play. But understand that in a society where popular sovereignty is the political formula, that is, the elites justify their rule over the nation by the perception that they're doing so in the name of the people that represent public opinion. The management of public opinion is a full-time occupation for the elites, and it has been carefully approached and very rigorously approached in this regard for now well over 100 years. You're living in a carefully cultivated environment in which public opinion as it exists has these long developed tropes because of 100 years of past manipulation in order to get the outcomes that successive series of elites have wanted. If you want to learn much more about the history of the management of public opinion, go over to Skeptical Waves channel and go through Walter Lippmann's work on public opinion to kind of ground yourself a little bit better in the techniques that have been used historically in order to manage this. And then, I'm not sure if somebody's written a definitive book about this yet, but consider the narrative collapse that has occurred in the modern era as a result of audience fragmentation due to streaming, due to social media, and then the attempted reconsolidation that we're seeing now through the algorithmic management of social media. It's a very interesting time in the history of Western countries for this reason. And you can see the way that these long-standing tropes in American politics, it's easy to see this in American politics. It's always easier to see how other people are manipulated, see how you're being manipulated. We go back to the 2016 election campaign between Trump. You can see this very clipped, very comic style that Trump used. Here we see the famous quip saying, "It's awfully good, it's only your temperament, with the temperament of Donald Trump, who's not in charge of the law in our country." And then Trump responds, "Because you'd be in jail." One of a long string of zingers that propelled him into the presidency. Think about this for a minute. Donald Trump cultivated a public persona as a kind of, he's extremely funny. He cultivated an unserious public figure quite intentionally. And the fact that the Democrats and media constantly tried to frame him as unserious really only reinforced the figure that he was trying to cultivate, cast in contrast to the kind of self-serious Barack Obama, who kind of was always going on about how historical a figure he was. A similar kind of thing with Hillary Clinton in her quest to be the first woman president, blah, blah, blah. You can see the contrast of images that they presented to the American people. And you can see how in a time of peace and safety, how that presentation was so successful. And you can see how now in a time of war, this same presentation, you can see this is a Truth Social post from Donald Trump, now become very famous. You got Donald Trump's face there overlaid with the American flag, classic internet culture. It says, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. We've all read this at this point. you can see how the same kind of bombastic, comedic style has led him to this moment in the management of public opinion. And you can see how, in a time of peace and safety in 2016, this was extremely popular. And you can see how, in a moment where military security is suddenly a much bigger issue because of the war in Ukraine, because of the war in Iran, because of the growing sense of unease about security felt by the American public, you can see where this image is running into some rocks. And some American presidents can, or some, not American presidents, some political figures can discard an image and pull on a new one, and some cannot. But you can certainly see that at this point, Donald Trump is a pretty well-established character in American politics. It would be very difficult for him to shift gears in a moment like this. Whereas in Canada, we've seen many prime ministers who suddenly discovered new aspects of their character at moments where it was politically convenient to do so. This audience may or may not remember the introduction of Justin Trudeau to public life as an amateur boxer playing a charity match with the name of the Conservative MP. You can see the way that he introduced himself as youthful, handsome, a representative, in contrast to Stephen Harper's kind of stodgy, grandfatherly almost demeanor. And you can see how when he got himself into the position of leader of the Liberal Party, how he melded that image of himself, that kind of youthful image of himself, with a kind of, you can almost see it like as a classic rock star aesthetic, where on the one hand you've got a portrayal of talent and capability, and on the other hand, a portrayal of youthful rebelliousness and inattention to the rules. And you can see how this was like messaging for Boomer and Gen X audience, as well as for millennial progressives who kind of laughed at the ultra feminism that was being presented at the time. However, like our friend Mr. Trump, Justin Trudeau had a problem. That problem was that the Canadian public did not want to be led by a man-child in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so Justin Trudeau, in his inimitable style, decided that the solution to this problem was to adopt a new wardrobe, to get some Just for Men touch of gray, and recraft himself as a serious and sober statesman. Now, this met with mixed success, but certainly you can see how the recraft of his image was attempted. And you can see it was enough to kind of just sneak him over the line against Aaron O'Toole, a man who has a lot of structural disadvantages in Canada's media ecosystem, and who is not an especially talented political figure. Now, all that in the rearview mirror, I want to recast it at our current political moment and identify the two styles of image that are being presented to us today in the dialectic between Pierre Poliever and Mark Carney, and point out why Pierre Poliever, who crafted his image specifically to target Justin Trudeau, has struggled so badly with the moment as it has moved on. Here we have Pierre Poliever in his most famous media moment, eating an apple and leveling kind of cost of living critiques at an embodiment of the Liberal Party. And the point here is to take aim at the kind of maverick image cultivated by Justin Trudeau and paint him as irresponsible, paint him as a person prone to excess, a person prone to make grandiose statements that he can't kind of come through on. This is the target of this kind of image. I want to play another clip here to drive home the point.
The rabbi tells me that on this stage, there have been 3 Israeli prime ministers, Elie Wiesel, and countless other dignitaries. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty big honor for a simple goy from the prairies to stand before you today.
He's so good at that. So as you can imagine. Absolutely perfect rural Canadian tech. I guarantee you this is not a natural part of Pierre Polievre's dialect. It is calculated. So as you can imagine, a simple goy from the prairies. So you can see how he's positioning himself in this very long Canadian tradition of prairie populism. He's putting himself in there as a stand-in for John Diefenbaker, though obviously enormously less talented role. And he's trying to, in the same way, critique or stand. You can see how, in contrast to a figure like Justin Trudeau, who has this kind of youthful, irresponsible part of his character, the characterizing himself as the embodiment of common sense, in contrast to this kind of rock star sensibility in an election fought over cost of living, is a very winning kind of media dialectic. The problem for Pierre Poliever is that he never got to fight an election versus Justin Trudeau on cost of living. He instead had to fight an election against Mark Carney, who is an entirely different political figure with an entirely different constructed image. Mark Carney has, not only does he to some extent naturally embody, but he has carefully crafted himself as the kind of Anglo manager who, again, is a deeply held figure in the history of Canadian politics. You can see, if you watch C.D. Howe speak and you watch Mark Carney speak, you can see the echoes. If you watch John P. Robarts speak, former Premier of Ontario, and watch Mark Carney speak, you can see the echoes of the mannerisms, the echoes of the image being adopted. And you can see he's kind of modified the image slightly for the modern world. Does the Tony Blair open collar, no tie look. But again, behind it, you've got the gray hair, you've got the measured manner, and listen to him speak for a moment.
The ceremony we just witnessed reflects the wonder of a country built on the bedrock of 3 peoples, Indigenous, French, and British. The office of the Governor-General links us through the Crown and across time to Canada's proud British heritage.
Now, I realize that it's somewhat accentuated by our friend on TikTok and the way that they've clipped that up, but you can hear that sort of short clipping style that anybody who's worked in an office in downtown Toronto is very familiar with. You can hear the kind of, you can almost feel the confidence that this imbues in a certain generation of older Canadians. And so in this dialectic, the strategy of framing the Liberals as unserious goes from a winning strategy versus Justin Trudeau to a losing strategy in dialectic. Every moment that he leans into his parochial character is a losing moment for Pierre Poliever in the political dialectic in the country, especially as the moment of crisis in Canada has been extended from COVID-19 into this kind of trade crisis the country faces in the United States. You can see how these kind of long-standing archetypes in Canadian politics play themselves out today, and you can see how Pierre Poliever has politically trapped himself. It is very unlikely that he's ever going to get to fight the election for which his image was carefully crafted. He's never going to be able to be the common sense conservative from the prairies, connected to the land, in contrast to the urbane, irresponsible young liberal. He is going to look, again, the fact that he's obviously younger than Mark Carney really is a problem for this image. And so my guess is Pierre Poliever will not get a chance to fight another election with Mark Carney, but if he does, he's going to be at an enormous political disadvantage, at least in this meta. Now, hypothetically, if the backdrop of the election, instead of being a backdrop of serious economic instability, becomes a backdrop of sort of peace and safety, like the backdrop of the 2016 election, suddenly there's all kinds of other places that Pierre Poliever can go. He can start framing Carney as self-serious. He can start framing Carney as kind of stuck up, and walk that particular road the way that Donald Trump did against Hillary Clinton. It's unclear whether the broad public frame will progress to this point in Canada between now and when another election is fought. But that's the way in which you could recover as Pierre Poliever. And if you're a conservative PR strategist, that's what you've got to be hoping for in order to fight an election. You've got to be able to fight an election common sense versus failed establishment. And you're not going to be able to fight an election common sense versus failed establishment in this media environment. You have to completely change the backdrop between now and the next election in order to have any real success in manufacturing consent for bringing somebody like Pierre Poliever. Now, you'll notice that throughout this review, I have not once talked about the substantive policy behind or that will be executed by any of these political figures. And there's a reason for that. The overwhelming majority of Canadians vote on one of two things. The overwhelming majority of Americans vote on one of two things. Either direct patronage, in which case the Conservative Party of Canada cannot compete with the Party of Canada. It's impossible. Or they vote on the basis of this kind of manufactured propaganda moment. And so because they lose on patronage, the only way for the Conservative Party to ever win in a Canadian election is to win a propaganda moment very hard. And now to win that propaganda moment, not just with the legacy Canadian population, but with some of the migrant groups as well. And you can see that Pierre Poliever is really not well situated to do that in any foreseeable future right at the moment. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you learned something.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.